But once again this morning we're going to talk about the topic of justice. And this is going to kind of wrap up our series, but it's not going to wrap up our series in such a way that, okay, now we don't have to think about justice anymore. Actually, this series, we hope, is a springboard to having issues of justice and addressing injustice to be an ongoing thing about who we are, because that's who it is that Christ has called us to be. In Psalms chapter 12, the psalmist declared that God is aware of the oppression of the weak and the groaning of the needy. And God says, I will protect them from those who malign them. In Psalm 45, it says that God rules with justice. Now, how is it that God brings about justice? Now, God could bring about justice in miraculous ways in which He needed no one else to be a part of the process. But actually, God chooses to work through you and me. God chooses to bring about justice in simple ways. God chooses to bring about justice through just us. God chooses to use us to be the conduit through which justice comes about. God chooses to use us to be His hands and His feet. Last week we read in Matthew 25 where Jesus declared that as we care for the least of these among us, it's as if we are caring for Him. God is at work bringing about justice, but He often doesn't do it through supernatural or extraordinary ways. God is at work bringing about justice by using just us. You remember the parable in Luke chapter 10 of the Good Samaritan. And actually leading up to that parable that Jesus tells, there's an interaction between Jesus and one of the experts of the law. And the expert of the law is actually trying to trap Jesus. And he says to Jesus, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And there's kind of an exchange between Jesus and the expert of the law about how it is that they can experience eternal life. And in that process, they conclude that you need to love God and love your neighbor. And then Jesus says to the expert in the law, now you should go and do likewise. Now, in response to Jesus' direction to go and do likewise, then the expert in the law asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Now, here's what I want you to notice in this conversation between Jesus and the expert of the law. For Jesus, inheriting eternal life was inseparable from loving. And loving was something that was expressed as they loved God and also loved their neighbor. And to take it a step further, I believe that Jesus is saying that you can't do justice without loving. Love is the motivation of why it is that we would seek to solve an injustice, why we would want to do justice in someone else's life, is because of the love of Christ that's being motivated in our hearts and in our lives. I believe that Jesus was making a connection between living out our faith day by day and also experiencing eternal life. Jesus is talking about doing things that you do with open arms that are seeking to make a difference for God's kingdom here on earth. Now, Jesus' response about loving God and loving neighbor is very open. His arms are very open and very all-inclusive. But I find that it's interesting how the expert in the law responds is he doesn't really want to open his arms. He doesn't really want to reach out and love to his neighbor very widely. And so instead of having open arms, he wants to figure out how close he can keep his arms to himself. He wants to figure